Okay, now we'll talk about the lower receiver. We're going to start by removing the selector lever. This particular model that I have is a semi-automatic. It's not fully automatic. There's a selector lever. It's held in place by this retainer here. What you want to do is get a hold of it and lift it, this end with the foot on it, lift it off of the selector lever, and the selector lever will just pull right out. Looking at that, this part where it comes up over the top, back of the frame here, it goes underneath the trigger pin. And there's a groove in the trigger pin. That retainer fits into that groove. Once you release the tension on it, by taking off the selector lever, it releases the tension on that, and you can actually use a drift punch to tap that out. Again, I like to work with a block so that the pin has some place to go. And I like to work from the side where that groove is, so that there's less opportunity for that retainer to catch on other things, and just push. You shouldn't need a hammer here. You should push out fairly easy. As you can see, it's getting caught on that little retainer. Just pop that retainer out of the way, and it will push right out. Pull that pin out, set it aside. That retainer will just pull right out. The trigger is held in place by this bar, that whole big sear bar. There's a small retainer piece right here that is actually what holds that in. You can actually just see the piece I'm talking about right there, this little wedge-shaped piece. It fits underneath the sear bar with the wedge facing down and forward so that it fits up underneath the trigger and holds the trigger in place. The back, which is squared off, fits into a squared out machined fitting on the sear bar. Now that brings us to the hammer and hammer spring assembly. I don't like this much because, as you can see, it's only held in by a clip. This little moon clip deal is not the greatest design in the world. To remove that, there's actually a lot of things I like to use this trick for when it comes to assembling and disassembling. Take a little bit of gear grease or some silicone grease and smear it all over the receiver in the direction that you're going to push that clip. What happens is, as that clip pushes off that direction, this glop of grease will make it stick instead of flying across the room on you. Put your finger over the top of it just in case. Push it with a flathead screwdriver. And pop off into that grease. And as you can see, that grease does a pretty good job of holding it there. And just take a shop rag, wipe your grease off. Now, you take that pin and it will push out. Just put your thumb over the top of the hammer and hammer spring assembly, pull that pin out, and then those will just release and come right out. There's that. It actually is very similar in design to an AR-15's hammer and hammer spring. Once that's out, that just leaves the sear bar, that little retainer piece, and the trigger. Now what you'll do is put your thumb on this, and you can see there's a spring in there that holds that in place. Put your thumb here, compress that spring, and it will release that retainer piece up front and the trigger. Keep them depressed, and that retainer will fall right out. The trigger won't fall right out because it's got a rubber boot on it, so you'll have to remove that rubber boot. Once you get that rubber boot off, now the trigger will just fall out. Release the tension slowly on that spring piece, and then this will come out. Now this will take a little bit of wiggling and finagling. Once you get the trigger out, you slide this forward. There's a little cup basically that sits back there that spring sits in. Pull that out, and that extra little bit of maneuvering will give you what you need to finagle this whole piece out. Now this, you basically have to get as high up in the corner as you can, collapse the spring, and then kind of muscle it out. That is the worst part about the disassembly and reassembly of this entire weapon, is getting this out, and worse yet, getting it back in. If you decide you want to replace the magazine release, or if this is broken you want to replace it, keeping everything compressed with your hand, just release that screw. Put your tools away so they don't get lost. And that back grip will come right out. Careful, because the magazine release just sets in there like that and is held in place by a pin right here. That magazine release spring, and then the pin that holds it in place literally will just all fall out in your hand as you pull that grip off.